There is a moment, and you may have already passed through it without fully understanding what occurred, when something inside you simply stops, not dramatically, not with announcement. It is not a decision you make with your conscious mind, the way you might decide to change careers or end a relationship. It is deeper than that and quieter. Something in the basement of your psyche sets down a weight it has carried so long that you had forgotten it was not part of your own body. You had mistaken the labor for your skeleton, and when it releases, you do not feel free. You feel strange. You feel wrong. You feel as though you have betrayed someone, though you cannot name who, and you cannot explain what you have done. This is the first signal, not of healing, that word is used too loosely, but of separation, psychological separation, the kind that was supposed to happen decades ago, in childhood, in adolescence, at the developmental threshold where a human being begins to distinguish between what they feel and what they were asked to feel on behalf of someone else. For you, that threshold was never crossed. It was not that you failed to cross it. It is that the crossing was made impossible by the very people who were supposed to help you reach it. The mother, the father, the family system that needed you to remain fused, to number remain available, to carry something that no child should ever have been asked to carry. And so you carried it so well, so completely, so seamlessly, that by the time you reached adulthood, you could no longer tell the difference between your emotions and theirs, between your anxiety and the anxiety that was placed into you before you had words, between your guilt and the guilt that was installed like a program into your nervous system so that you would never leave, never refuse, never say the one thing that would have changed everything. No. Let us be precise about this, because precision is what has been missing. What Jung described as the mother complex is not simply a difficult relationship with your mother. It is not resentment. It is not even trauma in the way most people use that word. The mother complex is a living psychological structure inside you, an autonomous constellation of emotion, memory, image, and expectation that operates beneath your awareness and governs how you relate to closeness, to need, to your own body, to the question of whether you are allowed to exist as a separate being. It does not ask your permission. It does not wait for you to be ready. It activates every time someone needs something from you, every time someone's voice carries a particular tone, not anger, not even cruelty, but that specific frequency of disappointment that you learned before language meant you had failed at the only task that mattered, and that task was never spoken aloud. That is what makes the mother complex so difficult to dismantle. It was not a rule that was handed to you in words. It was an atmosphere. It was the way the room changed when your mother was displeased. The way silence carried more weight than shouting. The way you learned to scan her face before you could read a single letter in a book. Because reading her face was the first literacy you needed in order to survive. Not physically, you were fed. You were clothed. Perhaps you were even praised. But psychologically, to survive psychologically in that house meant one thing: you had to make her comfortable. You had to regulate her emotions before you had any language for your own. You became the thermostat in a house where the temperature was never stable, and no one acknowledged that the furnace was broken. You may be sitting here now, years or decades later, and still performing that function, not with her. Perhaps she is no longer in your life. Perhaps she is deceased. Perhaps you have drawn what you believe to be a boundary, but the function remains. You perform it with partners, with friends, with colleagues, with strangers whose discomfort you can feel across a room the way others feel a draft. You walk into a gathering and within seconds your body has already completed a full scan: who is tense, who is pretending, who needs something, who is about to unravel. And before you have even taken off your coat, you have already begun adjusting yourself to manage what you have detected. This is not empathy. This is surveillance. This is a survival system that was built in a home where your safety depended on your ability to predict and manage the emotional states of someone who would not manage their own. And here is where the mechanism becomes important, because without understanding the mechanism, you will continue to mistake the pattern for your personality. You will say, I am just someone who feels deeply. You will say, I care too much. You will say, I cannot help it, but you can help it. The issue is not that you feel. Feeling is human. Feeling is necessary. The issue is that you were conditioned to feel on behalf of others as a substitute for being loved. The original transaction was not love for love. It was labor for proximity. It was self-erasure for the appearance of safety. And that transaction became the template for every relationship you entered afterward, not because you chose it, but because the unconscious does not offer choices, it offers repetitions. Jung called this repetition compulsion, and though the term originated with Freud, Jung understood its depth in a way that Freud did not. For Jung, the repetition was not simply a neurotic loop. It was the psyche's attempt to bring the original wound into consciousness. Every time you entered a relationship that required you to abandon yourself in order to maintain connection, your unconscious was not punishing you, it was presenting the pattern again, laying it on the table again, saying, look at this, see this, recognize what is happening. Not so that you could fix the other person, not so that you could finally perform the labor well enough to be loved, but so that you could see, at last, that the labor itself was the problem, that the transaction was never going to produce love because it was never a transaction of love. It was a transaction of control, and you were on the losing end of it from the beginning. This is difficult to hear, not because it is cruel, but because it implicates the one person you have spent your entire life protecting. The mother or the father, we will speak of him soon, because the father complex carries its own weight, its own silence, its own particular form of betrayal. But for now, let us stay with the mother, because for many of you, she is the one whose image still governs the inner landscape. She is the voice that speaks when no one else is in the room. She is the standard against which you measure every failure, every imperfection, every moment when you were not enough. And you must understand, you were never going to be enough, not because of any deficiency in you, but because what she needed from you was not something a child can provide. What she needed was a mirror, a regulator, a container for the parts of herself she could not face. And you became that container, not through choice, but through necessity. And the cost of that was the loss of your own psychological ground. You did not develop a stable sense of self because the ground on which that self would have stood was occupied. It was occupied by her needs, her moods, her unspoken demands, her fragility that was presented as strength, her control that was disguised as care. Think of a specific moment, not the worst moment, not the dramatic one, but the ordinary one. The Tuesday afternoon when you came home from school with something alive in your chest, some excitement, some small victory, some experience that was entirely yours, and you walked through the door and felt the atmosphere before you saw her face. Something was wrong. Something was always wrong, or on the verge of being wrong, and you did what you always did. You set your experience down. You folded it like a piece of clothing and placed it in a drawer inside yourself. And you turned your attention to her. You asked the right question. You softened your voice. You did not mention the thing that had made you happy. Because happiness in that house was not shared. It was monitored. If you were too happy, it meant you were not paying attention to her. If you were too independent, it meant you were abandoning her. So you learned to keep your joy small, to keep your needs invisible, to exist in a narrow band of emotional expression that would not trigger her withdrawal or her rage or, worst of all, that particular look of injury that said, "How could you do this to me?" You did nothing to her. You were a child, but in the architecture of the mother complex, the child is always guilty, not because guilt is rational, but because guilt is the mechanism by which fusion is maintained. If you feel guilty for having needs, you will not develop needs. If you feel guilty for saying no, you will never say no. If you feel guilty for existing as a separate person with separate desires, you will remain fused, merged, psychologically embedded in a relationship that feels like love but functions like captivity. Now, here is where the father complex enters, and it enters differently than you might expect. For many of you, the father was not the obvious source of wounding. He may have been absent, and his absence felt like neutrality rather than harm. He may have been present but passive, a figure who existed in the house but did not intervene, did not protect, did not step between you and the mother's emotional demands. Or he may have been the one whose approval you spent your entire life chasing, the one whose attention you could never quite secure, the one who was physically near but psychologically unreachable. The father complex does not always announce itself through violence or cruelty. It often announces itself through silence, through the specific kind of emptiness that forms in a child who looks toward the father for a model of strength, of boundary, of what it means to stand inside your own authority and finds nothing there. What this absence installs is not anger. Not at first. What it installs is a gap in the psyche where the capacity for self-authority was supposed to develop. You do not learn to trust your own judgment because there was no template for it. You do not learn to set boundaries because boundaries were never demonstrated. You do not learn that it is possible to be loved and separate at the same time because the only model of love you witnessed was the mother's version fused, conditional, and predicated on the surrender of your autonomy. And so you enter adulthood with two complexes operating simultaneously. The mother complex says your value lies in what you provide. The father complex says you have no ground to stand on. Together, they create a person who gives endlessly and never believes they have the right to stop, a person who feels everything and trusts nothing they feel, a person who is exquisitely attuned to the needs of others and profoundly disconnected from their own. And the world calls this sensitivity. The world calls this being a good person. The world rewards you for it, which is perhaps the cruelest part of the mechanism, because the reward makes the prison feel like a home. But something has started to shift. You may not be able to name it yet, and I would caution you against naming it too quickly, because the mind's first instinct is to package transformation into a narrative that makes it feel safe. And what is happening in you is not safe. It is not comfortable. It is the beginning of a separation that your entire psychological system was built to prevent. The inner thermostat that has regulated everyone else's temperature for decades is beginning to malfunction, not because it is broken, but because you are, for the first time, allowing it to turn off, and the silence that follows is not peace, not yet. It is the disorientation of someone who has lived their entire life in service to a sound and is now hearing, for the first time, what the room sounds like without it. The people around you will feel this before you understand it yourself. They will not say, "I notice you are individuating." They will not say, "I see that you are beginning to withdraw your projections." They will say something far more ordinary and far more revealing. They will say, "You have changed." They will say it with an edge in their voice. They will say, "You are not the same." They will frame it as concern, but beneath the concern is something else, a disturbance, because the system that relied on your emotional labor is registering the loss of its primary resource. You were the one who absorbed the tension, so no one had to face it. You were the one who apologized, so no one had to examine their own behavior. You were the one who kept the surface smooth, and now the surface is beginning to crack, and everyone can feel it. And no one is thanking you for stopping. No one is saying, "You were right to set that down." They are looking at you the way the family once looked at you when you failed to perform your function, with confusion, with irritation, with that unspoken accusation that says, "You are making this harder for everyone," and you will feel the pull, you will feel the old gravity dragging you back toward the function, because the guilt is still there, operating just beneath consciousness, whispering that you are selfish, that you are cold, that you are abandoning the people who need you. But this is not guilt. This is the complex speaking. This is the mother's voice internalized so deeply that you hear it as your own. And the work, the real psychological work, not the affirmation work, not the self-care work, but the deep structural dismantling that Jung pointed toward the work, is learning to hear that voice and recognize it as something that was placed inside you, not something you generated, not something true, something installed, something functional, something that served the system but never served you. You are standing at the edge of that recognition now, and the ground beneath you does not feel solid. It will not feel solid for some time. That is not a failure. That is the accurate sensation of a person who has lived on borrowed ground their entire life and is now, for the first time, being asked to find their own. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that does not come from effort. It does not come from working too many hours or sleeping too few. It comes from maintaining a shape that is not yours. You have been holding a posture, not a physical one, though your body carries it too, but a psychological posture that was designed before you had any say in the matter. It was designed by the family system, by the unspoken agreements that governed who was allowed to feel what, who was responsible for whose comfort, and who would be sacrificed so the structure could remain intact. You were the one selected, not through a formal process, not through cruelty necessarily, but through a kind of gravitational logic that operates in every family where the emotional center is unstable. Someone has to absorb the excess, someone has to become the regulator, and the one who is chosen is almost always the one who is most capable of feeling, not because sensitivity is a gift in that context, but because it is useful. You were useful, and usefulness became the closest thing to love you were allowed to receive. This is the unconscious bargain, and it must be named clearly because you have been living inside it so long that its walls have become invisible. The bargain was this: I will feel what you cannot feel. I will carry what you refuse to carry. I will make myself small, transparent, endlessly adjustable, so that you do not have to face the parts of yourself that frighten you. And in return, you will let me stay. You will not abandon me. You will not withdraw your presence entirely. You will give me just enough warmth, just enough acknowledgement, just enough intermittent closeness to keep me believing that this is love. It was not love, it was a contract, and the terms were set before you could read, before you could speak in full sentences, before you had any framework for understanding that what was being asked of you was not normal. Children do not have that framework. Children do not sit in their high chairs and think, this dynamic is exploitative. Children simply adapt. They adapt with a speed and totality that is breathtaking in its efficiency and devastating in its consequences, because the adaptation becomes the self. You did not develop a false self alongside your true self, the way you might put on a coat over your real clothing. The coat became the skin, the performance became the identity, and by the time you were old enough to question it, there was nothing underneath that you recognized as your own. This is why the process of separating from the mother complex or the father complex, or both, does not feel like liberation. It feels like dying, not physically, but psychologically, the structure that has held you together, the identity that has told you who you are in every room, every relationship, every moment of tension, that structure is dissolving and there's nothing yet to replace it. You reach inward for your sense of self and find an open space where something used to be, and your first impulse is panic. Your second impulse is to go back, to pick up the phone, to apologize for something you did not do, to smooth the surface again, because at least when you were smoothing the surface, you knew who you were. You were the one who smoothed. Let us examine what projection means in this context, because it is not an abstract concept. It is happening to you every day, and it is happening in both directions. When Jung spoke of projection, he was describing the mechanism by which the psyche takes its own unprocessed material, its shadow, its unacknowledged desires, its refused emotions, and places them onto another person, so that they can be experienced at a distance rather than owned internally. Your mother did this to you. She projected onto you the parts of herself she could not tolerate. Her neediness became your responsibility. Her anxiety became your atmosphere. Her unlived life became your obligation to fulfill, and you received these projections not because you were weak, but because you were open. Your permeability, your capacity to feel what others feel, made you the ideal screen for her unconscious cinema. She did not see you. She saw what she needed you to be. And you, desperate for connection, became it. But here is the part that is harder to face. You also project. You have been projecting onto others, onto partners, onto friends, onto authority figures, the very qualities that were suppressed in you by the original dynamic. You project your authority onto people who seem confident because your own authority was confiscated before it could develop. You project your anger onto people who express it freely because your anger was never permitted in the house where you grew up. You project your right to need things onto people who seem entitled, and you resent them for it, not realizing that what you resent is the freedom you were never allowed. Every time you feel a disproportionate reaction to someone, not ordinary irritation, but that deep cellular charge that says this person is wrong, this person is selfish, this person does not deserve what they have, you are looking at your own shadow, reflected back to you from the surface of another human being, and until you retrieve those projections, until you own the anger, the authority, the hunger that was forbidden, you will continue to give your power away to anyone who carries the qualities you have disowned. This is the mechanism that keeps you trapped in repetitive relationships. You do not choose the same kind of partner because you are foolish. You do not return to the same dynamic because you enjoy suffering. You return because the unconscious is not interested in your comfort. The unconscious is interested in completion. It is interested in bringing the unfinished pattern to the surface so that it can finally be seen, and it will use every relationship in your life to do so. The partner who withholds affection is not an accident. The friend who takes without reciprocating is not a coincidence. The colleague who dismisses your contributions and then absorbs your energy is not random. They are cast members in a production that your psyche has been staging since childhood. And you have been playing the same role in every performance. The one who gives, the one who adjusts, the one who abandons themselves at the precise moment when self-preservation would require them to stand still and say, "This is mine, and you cannot have it." Think of the last time you felt that particular collapse inside yourself. Not sadness, something more structural than sadness. That moment when you were in a conversation, perhaps with a partner, perhaps with a parent, perhaps with someone you trusted, and you felt yourself begin to speak your truth. And then you felt the atmosphere shift, and in that shift, a flicker of displeasure, a microsecond of withdrawal, a barely perceptible tightening around the other person's mouth. You folded. You did not finish the sentence, or you finished it, but you softened it so completely that it no longer carried the thing you meant. You heard yourself rearranging your own reality to accommodate their comfort, and part of you, a deep part, the part that still remembers what it felt like to have ground, that part screamed, not audibly, not even consciously, but somewhere in the architecture of your body, there was a protest, a contraction in your chest, a nausea that arrived without explanation, a sudden fatigue that made you want to leave the room, not because you were tired, but because you had just performed an act of self-betrayal so practiced, so automatic, that it was over before you even registered it had begun. That is repetition compulsion in its most intimate and destructive form. Not the grand repetitions, not the pattern of choosing narcissistic partners, though that is real, but the micro repetitions, the hundreds of small surrenders that happen every week, every day, in conversations that seem ordinary, but are in fact the site of an ongoing psychological abdication. Every time you swallow a sentence, you are rehearsing the original submission. Every time you monitor someone's face before deciding whether your feeling is acceptable, you are performing the scan you learned in childhood, to the scan that says, "Is it safe to exist right now, or must I disappear again?" And every time you disappear, you reinforce the neural pathway that tells your nervous system that disappearance is survival, that invisibility is safety, that the self is a luxury you cannot afford. But here is what is beginning to change, and it is changing not because you decided it should, but because something in the psyche has reached a threshold. There is a limit to how long a human being can sustain the posture of self-erasure before the deeper self. What Jung called the self, the organizing center of the total psyche, begins to push back, not gently, not with affirmation or encouragement, but with symptoms, with depression that does not respond to circumstance, with anxiety that seems to have no object, with a flatness, a grayness, a loss of meaning that settles over your life like fog and refuses to clear no matter how many adjustments you make on the surface. These symptoms are not signs that you are broken. They are signs that the true self is rejecting the false structure, They are the psyche's way of saying, I will not continue under these terms. You may ignore me, you may medicate me, you may distract yourself with another relationship, another project, another round of caretaking someone else's emotional wreckage. But I will not stop, because what I am asking for is not optional. What I am asking for is your life, and this is the point at which the father complex becomes especially relevant, because the father complex governs your relationship to authority, not just external authority, but your own inner authority. Your capacity to say, this is what I know, and I will stand by it. Your capacity to hold a position when someone else's displeasure is pressing against you. Your capacity to take up space not apologetically, but as a matter of right. As a matter of fact, the way a tree takes up space, not because it has earned permission, but because it has roots. If the father was absent physically or psychologically, then this capacity was never modeled for you. You did not see someone stand inside their own authority with steadiness. You did not see someone hold a boundary without cruelty. You did not witness the quiet, unremarkable competence of a person who knows where they end and where another begins. What you witnessed instead was either absence or collapse. Either the father was not there, in which case you had no template for inner structure, or the father was there but subordinate, dominated by the mother's emotional force field, unable to protect you or himself, modeling a kind of helplessness that you absorbed without knowing it. And what that installed in you is not just a lack of confidence, it is a structural gap, a missing floor in the building of your psyche. You can build walls, you can furnish rooms, you can hang pictures and arrange furniture, but there is a level beneath all of it that is simply not there. And when you try to stand on your own authority, you feel the absence, you feel the floor give way, and you retreat to the only solid ground you know, the mother's ground, the ground of service, of fusion, of making yourself useful, because useful is the only thing that ever felt stable. The shadow operates here with particular precision. The shadow, in Jung's framework, is not your darkness in the dramatic sense. It is everything about you that was forced underground by the conditions of your early environment. If anger was not permitted, your anger went into the shadow. If ambition was treated as selfishness, your ambition went into the shadow. If joy was met with suspicion or punishment, your joy went into the shadow, and the shadow does not simply sit in the basement and wait. It leaks. It leaks through your body, through tension, through chronic pain, through the particular pattern of holding your breath that you do not even notice anymore. It leaks through your relationships, through the resentment you feel toward people who seem free, the envy you feel toward people who take without apology, the quiet rage that surfaces when someone crosses a boundary you never set because you did not believe you had the right. It leaks through your dreams, where the images that your waking life refuses to acknowledge come flooding in with a clarity and intensity that your conscious mind cannot produce. The shadow is not your enemy, the shadow is your exile, It contains the parts of you that would have made you whole if they had been allowed to develop. It contains the no that was silenced, the anger that was forbidden, the desire that was shamed, the power that was confiscated, and the process of individuation, the process that Jung placed at the center of his entire psychology, is not about defeating the shadow, it is about retrieving it. It is about going down into the basement of your own psyche and finding the parts of yourself that were locked away by the family system and bringing them back into the light, not to act on them blindly, not to become the thing you feared, but to integrate them, to allow them to inform your life with the fullness and weight and complexity that they were always meant to carry. And this is where the people around you become uncomfortable, because when you begin to retrieve your shadow, when you begin to reclaim your anger, your authority, your right to exist as a separate being with separate needs, you are not just changing yourself, you are changing the system, you are disrupting the equilibrium that everyone else had adjusted to. The partner who relied on your compliance will feel the shift. The parent who relied on your guilt will feel the shift. The friend who relied on your endless availability will feel the shift, and they will not celebrate it. They will resist it. They will call it selfishness. They will call it coldness. They will say you have changed, and they will mean it as an accusation. Because in the economy of your relational world, your labor was the currency, and you have just stopped paying. You are not selfish. You are separating, and separation, in the Jungian sense, is not abandonnement. It is the prerequisite for any relationship that is real. You cannot truly love someone you are fused with. Because fusion is not love, it is dependency wearing the mask of intimacy. You cannot truly give to someone when giving is compulsive, when it is driven not by generosity, but by the terror of what will happen if you stop. The giving that comes from the complex is not giving, it is purchasing, it is the continuous payment of a debt that was never yours, issued by a creditor who will never acknowledge that the debt has been paid because the debt was never real. It was a fiction, a story told by the family system to keep you in place, and you believed it because you were a child. And children believe what they must in order to survive. But you are not a child now. And the part of you that knows this, the part that has been growing in the silence beneath the exhaustion, beneath the guilt, beneath the endless performance of adequacy, that part is not asking you to fight. It is not asking you to rage against the people who shaped you. It is asking something far more difficult. It is asking you to stop, to stand still, to allow the emptiness that follows the withdrawal of your labor to exist without rushing to fill it, because that emptiness is not a void, it is a clearing, it is the space in which something that belongs to you, something that has always belonged to you, can finally begin to take root, not quickly, not with the urgency your mind wants to impose on it. The mind, trained as it has been by decades of vigilance, wants a timeline. It wants to know when the discomfort will end, when the new identity will solidify, when the ground will feel stable again. But the psyche does not operate on the mind's schedule. The psyche operates on its own clock, And that clock is measured not in days or weeks, but in layers, layers of recognition, layers of grief, layers of slow, almost imperceptible shifts in the way you hold yourself when no one is watching. And this is the phase you are entering now, the quiet phase, the phase that no one writes about because it is not dramatic, because it does not photograph well, because there is no triumphant moment to point to and say there, that is where it happened. Nothing happens in this phase. And that is precisely the point. After a lifetime of happening, of performing, of responding, of adjusting, of absorbing, the absence of happening feels like failure. It feels like regression. You will wake up on certain mornings and feel nothing, not peace, not clarity, not even sadness, a blankness, a neutrality that your nervous system does not recognize because your nervous system was calibrated for crisis. It was built to detect threat, to anticipate rupture, to prepare for the next emotional emergency before it arrived. And now there is no emergency, and your body does not know what to do with that. You may find yourself standing in your kitchen, holding a cup of something warm, staring at the wall, not thinking, not processing, just standing, and a voice inside you, the complex's voice, the old operating system will say, "You are wasting time." It will say, "You should be doing something." It will say, "Someone probably needs you right now." And for the first time, you will hear that voice and recognize it as a foreign object, not your voice, not your thought, a program, a subroutine that has been running since before you had the capacity to question it, and you will not obey it. Not because you are strong, strength has nothing to do with this, but because something in you is too tired to perform the old function and too awake to pretend it still makes sense. This is not a breakdown. This is what Jung described as the withdrawal of projections, and it is one of the most disorienting experiences a human being can undergo. When you withdraw a projection, you are not simply changing your mind about another person. You are reclaiming a piece of your own psyche that you had outsourced. You are taking back the authority you placed in your father's absence. You are taking back the worthiness you placed in your mother's approval. You are taking back the permission to exist that you placed in every partner, every friend, every authority figure who seemed to have the solidity you lacked. And when those projections return to you, they do not arrive neatly packaged with instructions. They arrive as confusion, as emptiness, as a strange and destabilizing sensation of being in a room full of people and no longer knowing what role you are supposed to play. This is because you have been living inside a projection field your entire life. Every relationship you entered was filtered through the lens of the complex. Every person you loved was, to some degree, a screen onto which you projected either the mother or the father or both, layered and intertwined in ways that your conscious mind could never fully track. The partner who was emotionally unavailable was not simply a person who happened to be emotionally unavailable. They were a replication of the father's absence. And your attraction to them was not romantic, it was archaeological, You were digging for the thing that was buried in childhood. You were trying to find in the body of another person the ground that was never laid inside you, and every time you failed, every time the partner withdrew, every time the closeness you sought dissolved into the same familiar distance, you experienced not just the pain of the present moment, but the reactivation of the original wound. The child inside you was not metaphorically hurt. The child inside you was neurologically reactivated, flooded with the same helplessness, the same desperate need to fix, to reach, to make yourself small enough or good enough or invisible enough to earn what should never have required earning. And the partners who were controlling, who were dominant, who filled every room with their needs and left no space for yours, they were the mother's projection, not your mother herself, but the psychic imprint she left. The template that said love looks like this, love is someone else's needs, consuming the room, while yours wait outside the door. You chose those partners not because you wanted to suffer, but because the unconscious does not distinguish between familiar and good. Familiar is what the unconscious seeks, because familiar is what the nervous system recognizes as home, even when home was the place where you lost yourself. So when you begin to withdraw these projections, when you stop looking for your father in every authority figure and your mother in every intimate partner, the relational landscape around you changes, not because the people change, they remain exactly who they are, but because you are no longer seeing them through the distortion of the complex, and what you see when the projection lifts can be deeply unsettling. You see the partner not as the powerful figure who held the key to your worthiness, but as an ordinary person with their own wounds, their own limitations, their own unconscious patterns that have nothing to do with you. You see the parent not as the towering force that governed your inner world, but as a human being who was themselves governed by complexes they never examined. And you feel in that seeing a grief that has no name and no obvious source, not anger. Anger may come later, and it has its place, but grief, the grief of recognizing that what you were searching for in those relationships was never there. Not because the people were bad, but because what you needed, a ground, a mirror, a stable presence that said you are real, you are separate, you are allowed, was something that no other person could ever provide. It was something that could only be built inside you, and the building of it requires the very emptiness you are now standing in. Let me be direct about something that the therapeutic culture tends to soften. This emptiness is not pleasant. It is not a cocoon. It is not a chrysalis from which you will emerge transformed and radiant. Those metaphors serve the mind's desire for narrative, for a shape that promises resolution, but the psyche does not owe you a narrative. What the psyche owes you is the truth. And the truth is that the space between the old identity and the new one is not a passage, it is a field, an open, unstructured, wind-swept field where there are no markers and no paths and no one to tell you which direction to walk. You will stand in that field and feel the absence of every structure that once told you who you were, the good daughter, the reliable one, the sensitive one, the one who holds everything together, those identities were not you. They were functions assigned by the system, and now that the system no longer requires your performance, or rather, now that you are no longer willing to perform, the identities have fallen away, and what is left is a person you do not yet recognize. This is where many people turn back. This is the precise juncture at which the pull of the old dynamic becomes almost irresistible, because the old dynamic, for all its pain, had structure, it had predictability, it had a role for you to play, and playing a role, even a role that costs you everything, is less terrifying than standing in the open with no role at all. You will be tempted. A phone call will come. An old pattern will present itself. Someone will need you in that specific way that activates the deepest wiring in your nervous system. And your body will respond before your mind has time to intervene. The chest will tighten, the breath will shallow. The old readiness will flood through you, the readiness to serve, to smooth, to sacrifice, and for a moment you will feel like yourself again. The familiar self, the useful self, the self that knew its place. And if you go back, if you pick up the phone and resume the function, no one will blame you. The system will welcome you. The people who need your labor will sigh with relief. And the surface will smooth over as if nothing happened. And the quiet revolution that was forming inside you will retreat into the underground once more. This is not a moral failure. It is simply what happens when the pull of the familiar exceeds the tolerance for the unknown, and for some people, it happens many times before the final separation occurs. The psyche is patient. It will present the opportunity again. It always does. But if you stay, if you remain in the field, in the emptiness, in the unbearable openness of not knowing who you are, something begins to shift, not dramatically, not with revelation, more like a slow adjustment of weight. You notice that your body, which has been clenched for years in the posture of readiness, begins to settle differently. Not relax, that word implies a conscious decision, but settle, the way sediment settles when the water finally stops being stirred. You notice that you can sit in a room without scanning it. You notice that someone else's discomfort, which once would have launched you into immediate compensatory action, now registers as information rather than instruction. You feel it, but you do not move toward it. You observe it, and you stay where you are. And this small, unremarkable, invisible act of staying where you are is the most radical thing you have ever done. Because what you are doing in that moment is refusing the complex, not fighting it, not arguing with it, not analyzing it into submission, simply refusing to obey it. The complex says move, and you remain still. The complex says fix, and you let the fracture exist. The complex says you are responsible, and you allow the other person to carry their own weight for perhaps the first time in the history of your relationship with them. And the silence that follows that refusal is enormous. It is not comfortable, it is not affirming, it is the silence of a system that has lost its primary regulator and does not know how to function without you. This is the structural shift, and it must be understood structurally because the emotional framing, the language of healing, of growth, of becoming your best self, obscures the mechanism. What is happening is not emotional, it is architectural. You were a load-bearing wall in a building that was not yours. You were holding up a structure, a family system, a relational pattern, an entire emotional economy that would collapse without your support. And you have stepped out from under the weight, not because you are angry, not because you want the building to fall, but because the weight was never yours to carry. It was placed on you before you could consent, and it has been crushing you so slowly and so steadily that you mistook the compression for your natural shape. Your natural shape is not compressed. Your natural shape is not small. Your natural shape is not bent in the posture of perpetual accommodation. But you do not know what your natural shape is yet, because you have never been allowed to discover it. That discovery cannot happen while you are holding up someone else's structure. It can only happen in the aftermath, in the space that opens when the weight is released, in the quiet that follows the refusal. And the grief will come. It will not come as a wave. That metaphor is too dramatic for what actually happens. It will come as a series of small recognitions, moments, when you suddenly understand, with the clarity of a bell being struck, what was taken from you, not just what was done to you, the emotional labor, the self-erasure, the conditional love, but what was prevented, the childhood you did not have, the spontaneity that was never safe, the joy that was always monitored, the anger that was never expressed, the self that was never formed. You will grieve not just the past, but the absence of a past, the empty space where a different life might have grown if the conditions had been different. And this grief will not resolve neatly. It will not lead to forgiveness, at least not in the way forgiveness is typically packaged as a decision, a moment, a letting go. If forgiveness comes, it will come much later, and it will come not as an act of will, but as a natural consequence of having fully faced what happened. You do not forgive by deciding to forgive. You forgive by understanding so completely that the need for resentment dissolves on its own. And you are nowhere near that point yet. You are in the field. You are in the silence. You are standing without a role, without a function, without the familiar weight that once told you who you were. And beneath your feet, something is forming, not quickly, not visibly, but the ground that was never given to you in childhood, the ground of your own authority, your own boundaries, your own capacity to know what you feel, and trust that it is real. That ground is being laid, not by anyone else, not by a therapist, not by a book, not by a teaching, by you, by the simple, excruciating, unglamorous act of standing still long enough for your own roots to find soil, not the soil of someone else's approval, not the soil of being needed, not the borrowed ground of usefulness or compliance, or the quiet martyrdom that the world mistakes for virtue. Your own soil, the dark, unfamiliar, unprocessed material of your own psyche, the very material you were taught to avoid, to manage, to keep sealed beneath the performance of being fine. You are not fine. You have never been fine. And the most important thing that is happening to you right now is that you are finally allowing yourself to not be fine without reaching for the nearest person to fix it, without translating your pain into service, without converting your grief into someone else's comfort. You are sitting inside your own experience for what may be the first time in your conscious life. And it is unbearable not because the experience is too much, but because you have no practice. You have decades of practice sitting inside other people's experiences. You have a PhD in the emotional weather of every room you have ever entered. But you have almost no practice sitting inside your own weather, your own storm, your own stillness. And so it feels foreign, it feels dangerous, it feels like something is wrong. Nothing is wrong. Something is, for the first time, right. But rightness, when it arrives after a lifetime of distortion, does not feel like rightness. It feels like disorientation. It feels like the ground is tilting. It feels like losing your mind, when in fact you are finding it, finding the mind that existed before the complex colonized it, before the mother's needs became your operating system, before the father's absence became the hole in your floor. Let us return to the mechanism one final time, because understanding the mechanism is what separates genuine psychological movement from the endless loop of insight without change. The mother complex and the father complex do not dissolve because you understand them. Understanding is necessary but insufficient. They dissolve slowly, incompletely, over years because you stop feeding them every time you refuse to perform the old function. The complex weakens, not because you have defeated it, but because you have withdrawn the energy that sustained it. The complex is not a tumor that must be excised. It is a pattern that must be starved. And you starve it not through dramatic gestures of defiance, but through the accumulation of small, almost invisible refusals. The phone rings, and you do not answer, not because you are punishing anyone, but because you recognize that the urgency you feel is not yours. It is the complex activating, telling you that someone's discomfort is your emergency, and you let the phone ring, you let the discomfort exist without intervening. You allow the other person to sit inside their own feeling without rushing in to metabolize it for them. And each time you do this, the neural pathway that has been running the old program weakens by a fraction. So small it is almost unmeasurable. But it weakens, and simultaneously, a new pathway is forming, a pathway that says, I am allowed to be here without justification. I am allowed to take up space without earning it through labor. I am allowed to feel what I feel without first checking whether my feeling is convenient for someone else. This pathway is fragile. It is an infant structure in a psyche dominated by ancient architecture, and the old architecture will fight for its survival because complexes do not surrender willingly. They have been running the system for too long. They have built alliances with every part of your identity that depends on the old role, the part that feels virtuous in self-sacrifice. the part that feels superior in its sensitivity, the part that secretly believes that its suffering is proof of its depth. These parts are not your enemies, but they are not your allies in this process either. They are the complex's lieutenants, and they will whisper to you in your own voice, using your own values, telling you that what you are doing is wrong, that you are becoming hard, that you are losing the very quality that made you special. You are not losing anything that was ever truly yours. You are losing the performance. You are losing the exhausting, soul-consuming performance of being endlessly available, endlessly accommodating, endlessly willing to set yourself on fire to keep someone else's house warm. And what remains when that performance ends is not coldness. What remains is not the opposite of what you were. What remains is something far more complex, far more textured, far more human than the role ever allowed you to be. Think of this carefully. When you were operating inside the complex, your emotional range was artificially narrowed. You were permitted certain feelings, compassion, concern, guilt, anxiety on behalf of others, and you were forbidden others. Anger was forbidden, or permitted only in its muted forms: frustration, disappointment, the tight-lipped silence that signals displeasure without ever stating it directly. Desire was forbidden, or permitted only when it aligned with what someone else wanted for you. Joy was permitted only in moderation, only when it did not threaten the emotional economy of the family, only when it could be shared in a way that did not make your mother feel excluded or your father feel irrelevant. You lived inside a narrow corridor of acceptable emotion, and you mistook that corridor for the whole house. The whole house is vast. The whole house contains rooms you have never entered. The whole house contains anger that is clean and direct and does not apologize for itself. It contains desire that is not contingent on anyone else's approval. It contains grief that is not performative, that does not exist to signal your sensitivity to others, but that simply is raw, unmediated, yours. It contains a capacity for solitude that is not loneliness but sovereignty, the capacity to be alone without being abandoned, the capacity to sit in silence without scanning for the next emergency, the capacity to wake in the morning and ask, not what does anyone need from me, but what is alive in me today. That question, what is alive in me, may be the most foreign question you have ever encountered. You may ask it and hear nothing. You may ask it and feel only the echo of decades of not being permitted to ask it. That is fine. The question does not need to produce an immediate answer. The question needs only to be asked and asked again and asked again until the part of you that has been buried beneath the complex begins to trust that someone is finally listening, not someone else. You are listening to yourself, perhaps for the first time without an agenda, perhaps for the first time without the implicit follow-up question of, and how can I use what I hear to be more useful to someone else? You will notice as this process continues that your relationships begin to reorganize, Some will deepen, some will end, and the ones that end will not always end with conflict. Some will simply become impossible to sustain, not because anyone has done anything wrong, but because the dynamic was built on a foundation that no longer exists. The foundation was your compliance. The foundation was your willingness to be the emotional infrastructure, and without that foundation, the relationship has no structure. It was never a relationship of two separate people meeting each other in mutual recognition. It was a relationship of one person performing a function and another person consuming that function. And when the function ceases, there is nothing left. This is painful, it is necessary, and it is not your fault. The relationships that survive this process, and some will be the ones that are capable of reorganizing around a new dynamic, the dynamic of two people who are each standing on their own ground, each carrying their own weight, each responsible for their own emotional weather. These relationships will feel different from anything you have known. They will feel less intense, and at first you will mistake less intensity for less love. You will miss the heat of the old pattern, the urgency, the need, the high voltage current of being indispensable to someone who could not function without you. That heat was not love. That heat was the friction of two unresolved complexes grinding against each other, generating energy that felt like passion but was in fact desperation. Real connection does not generate heat in that way. Real connection generates warmth, steady, sustainable, unremarkable warmth. The warmth of being seen without being consumed, the warmth of being known without being needed, the warmth of someone who is glad you are in the room, but would not collapse if you left it. This is what integration looks like, and it does not look the way you imagined. You imagined, perhaps, that healing would feel like arrival, that there would be a moment when the work was done and you could rest in the certainty of your own wholeness. But integration is not arrival. Integration is the ongoing, daily practice of holding complexity without resolution. It is the ability to carry your anger and your compassion in the same body without one canceling the other. It is the ability to love the people who shaped you and also see clearly and without flinching the damage they caused. It is the ability to grieve and function simultaneously, to feel the old pull of the complex and choose not to follow it. Not because you are healed, but because you are aware. Awareness does not eliminate the pattern. Awareness gives you the half second of space between the stimulus and the response, and in that half second, you make a different choice. Not a perfect choice, not a final choice, a different one. And over time, those different choices accumulate into a different life. You are not becoming a new person. You are becoming the person who was always underneath the function, and that person is not what the complex told you they would be. The complex told you that without the role, without the labor, without the perpetual service, you would be nothing. You would be empty. You would be unlovable. The complex lied. Not maliciously. Complexes do not have intentions, but structurally, the complex maintained itself by convincing you that you and it were the same thing, that without it you would cease to exist. But you are not the complex, you are the one who carried it, and you are still here, standing in the open, in the field, without the weight, and you have not disappeared. You are less certain than you were before. You are less comfortable. You are less willing to perform the old smile, the old accommodation, the old seamless adjustment to someone else's unspoken need. But you are more present, more weighted, more real in a way that does not require validation, because it is not a performance, it is a fact. You are here. You are standing on your own ground, and the ground is holding, not because someone gave it to you, not because you earned it through sufficient suffering or adequate understanding, but because the ground was always there, beneath the complex, beneath the performance, beneath the decades of borrowed identity. It was there the way bedrock is there beneath topsoil, invisible, unacknowledged, but structurally sound. You did not create it. You uncovered it by setting down what was never yours, by standing still when every conditioned impulse told you to move, by allowing the emptiness to exist long enough for it to reveal itself not as absence but as space, your space, the space in which you are permitted to exist without justification, without labor, without the continuous proof of your value through self-sacrifice. You will not feel triumphant, you will feel sober, you will feel the weight of your own life resting on your own shoulders for the first time. And it will feel different from the weight you carried before, not lighter, but yours, the weight of your own choices, your own desires, your own unresolved questions, your own grief that no longer belongs to anyone else's story. This is what Jung meant by individuation, not the achievement of perfection, but the acceptance of totality, the willingness to be whole, which means the willingness to be complicated, contradictory, incomplete, and still worthy of the ground you stand on. You do not need to explain this to anyone. You do not need to justify the changes others see in you. You do not need to translate your internal process into a language that makes the people around you comfortable. They will adjust or they will not. That is their work. Yours is simpler and harder. Yours is to remain where you are, to keep standing, to let the roots grow in the dark where no one can see them, where no one can evaluate them, where no one can tell you whether they are growing fast enough or deep enough or in the right direction. They are your roots. They will grow at their own pace, and the ground beneath you, to the ground you uncovered by refusing to carry what was never yours, that ground is not going anywhere. It has been waiting for you longer than you know.